Nova Arlen sat in the cockpit of the research vessel Aurora, staring out at the endless stretch of black space dotted with distant stars. She was only 29, but already one of the youngest captains in the human stellar fleet. Her hair, dark and tied back in a tight braid, swayed slightly with the movements of the ship. Her eyes, sharp and bright, scanned the instruments before her. Everything seemed normal, or as normal as it could in the uncharted regions of the Orion expanse. The mission was simple: chart a new path through a sector of space that had resisted all previous human mapping efforts. Nova's crew, a mix of seasoned veterans and fresh recruits, worked quietly around her. The hum of the engines and the soft beeping of monitors created a calm rhythm in the command deck. Nova loved these moments of quiet before discovery. The unknown always called to her, a silent invitation she could not resist. Aurora maintained course 227 Mark 5. Keep sensors active. We don't want any surprises, she ordered, her voice calm but firm. Yes, Captain, replied Lieutenant Mara, her communications officer, eyes glued to the glowing console. The ship moved smoothly, gliding past asteroids and frozen gas clouds. For hours, the crew worked in perfect synchronization, checking readings, scanning for anomalies, and taking samples from tiny drifting debris. Nova watched the stars and felt a sense of peace. But peace in space, she knew, was always temporary. At exactly 22:47 ship time, the sensors picked up something unusual. A shimmering distortion appeared in the space ahead, like a ripple across the fabric of reality itself. Nova leaned forward, her fingers tightening around the edge of the console. What is that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Unknown, Captain, Mara answered. It doesn't match any known phenomena. Energy readings are unstable. Extremely high. Nova felt a thrill of excitement. This was why she had become an explorer. The unknown, the mysterious, the dangerous. It all called to her better than any safe orbit ever could. Bring us closer, she said, but slowly. Keep shields on maximum. The ship drifted toward the anomaly. As they approached, the distortion seemed to grow, stretching and twisting in impossible ways. The stars around them warped and bent as if reality itself was trembling. Captain, it's affecting our instruments, Mara said, her voice tight with concern. Navigation is failing. Nova's jaw tightened. She had trained for this. Sudden gravitational anomalies, radiation bursts, even encounters with strange cosmic objects. But nothing in her training prepared her for this. The distortion pulsed and a strange hum filled the cabin, deep and vibrating as if the universe itself was alive. Brace for impact, Nova said. The Aurora shuddered violently. Lights flickered. The hum became a roar that resonated in every bone. Nova gripped the controls as the ship twisted and jerked, pulled toward the shimmering rift. Outside, the stars stretched into lines, a cosmic tunnel that made her stomach lurch, and then, suddenly, everything went black. Nova opened her eyes to find herself floating, not in the cockpit, not even in the ship. She was in a strange, endless void. There was no up or down, no stars, no light, just an infinite darkness, smooth and silent. Her body felt weightless, her mind alert but disoriented. Nova? Captain? Came a voice, distant and echoing. It was Lieutenant Mara. Nova tried to answer, but her own voice seemed swallowed by the void. Panic rose, but she forced it down. Nova had survived impossible situations before. She had trained for emergencies, for moments when everything seemed lost. This was another test. Nova focused, trying to understand the space around her. It was not entirely empty. Faint lights, almost like whispers, flickered far away. She realized with a shiver that these were echoes, shadows of her crew, her ship, even herself. Her mind raced. Could this be some kind of dimensional rift? The human stellar fleet had speculated about such anomalies, but they had never been observed. And yet, here she was, staring into one. Hours, or maybe minutes, she could not tell, passed as she floated, trying to reach the echoes. She discovered she could move her thoughts toward them, sending a pulse of her awareness. Slowly, the echoes responded, faint but perceptible. Nova, Mara's voice was clearer now, a whisper carried by some unseen current. We're here, we're not gone. Nova smiled, relief mixing with determination. They were alive in some form. If she could find a way to reach them, to pull them back into reality, she would. She would not leave anyone behind. The void responded strangely to her thoughts. Streams of energy, thin and delicate, began to stretch toward her. forming patterns she could almost manipulate. It was as if the void itself were a canvas and her mind could paint upon it. "This is incredible," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. We can work with this." Days, or perhaps a single endless day, passed. Nova learned to move through the void, guiding the energy streams toward the scattered echoes of her crew. It was exhausting, but her human mind was clever, adaptive. She devised ways to communicate, sending signals of hope and instructions to the fragments of consciousness around her. Through trial and error, she discovered that she could form a temporary link with Mara. It was weak, flickering, but it worked. "We survive," Mara said finally. "Because of you." Nova felt a warmth in her chest. She had always believed in the strength of humans, their creativity, their resilience, their stubborn hope. She had never realized how far those traits could reach beyond the stars, beyond physical reality itself. But the void was not entirely kind. Strange currents of anti-life energy swept past, threatening to scatter the echoes she had gathered. The void tested her at every turn, pushing her to despair, tempting her to give up. But Nova refused. Her human spirit would not be broken. She focused, gathering the threads of life around her, weaving them into a fragile pattern that could survive the void's chaos. She thought of her crew, of her family, of humanity itself. Each thought was a lifeline, a spark of strength she could share. And then, just as suddenly as the void had swallowed her, Nova felt herself pulled again. The infinite darkness stretched, twisting and bending, but she clung to her lifeline. She felt the first signs of physical reality, the faint hum of machinery, the familiar pull of gravity, as the Aurora's systems began to stabilize. Nova opened her eyes. The cockpit lights flickered, showing the familiar instruments and the faces of her crew. They were alive, shaken, tired, but alive. She took a deep breath, tears stinging her eyes. "Humanity had survived even at the edge of life and nothingness, Captain," Mara said, voice trembling but full of relief. You saved us," Nova smiled, brushing back her damp hair. "We saved each other," she said. "And humanity, we're far stronger than even this void could imagine." As the Aurora drifted back toward known space, Nova stared out at the stars once more. The universe was vast, strange, and dangerous, but humanity would face it with courage, creativity, and hope. And Nova knew that whatever waited at the edge of life and nothingness, humans would rise to meet it, because that was who they were. The adventure had only begun. Nova floated in the endless darkness, her senses alert to every flicker of energy around her. The void was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Stars, planets, even time itself seemed meaningless here. Yet she was not alone. Faint pulses of light danced in the distance, echoes of her crew and fragments of the Aurora. She focused, reaching out with her mind as if it were a net. Slowly she gathered the fragments, weaving them together like threads in a fragile tapestry. Each pulse she captured revealed a memory, a feeling, a spark of life. Nova realized that the void was not empty. It was alive in a way she could barely understand, a mirror of consciousness itself. Nova took a deep breath. "If I can guide them, if I can bring them together, we can survive this," she whispered. Her voice seemed to carry across the void, reaching the flickering lights around her. She started with Lieutenant Mara, whose pulse of light hovered closest. "Mara, focus on me. Follow the thread," Nova said, her thoughts clear and steady. Slowly the pulse moved toward her, weaving itself into a stronger, brighter signal. "Yes, Captain," Mara's voice came faintly. "I'm trying." Encouraged, Nova reached for the others. Engineer Kellen, Navigator Jiro, and even the youngest recruit, Lyra. Each was a faint echo at first, scattered like sparks in a storm. But Nova's human determination and clear focus allowed her to guide them. One by one, their pulses joined hers, forming a small cluster of light that glimmered against the endless darkness. But the void did not make it easy. Strange currents of energy swept past like invisible waves, scattering the echoes and twisting them apart. Nova struggled to maintain the connections, using her mind to stabilize the fragile threads. She realized that the void reacted to her emotions. Fear, doubt, or anger made the currents stronger. Calm focus and hope made them weaker. "Steady," Nova muttered, closing her eyes. She imagined each crew member safe, healthy, alive. She pictured the Aurora intact, her team working together and the stars shining outside the ship. Slowly, the void's turbulence eased and the cluster of lights became brighter, more solid. Hours, or maybe days, time was strange here, passed as Nova guided the crew. She learned that her thoughts could shape the energy around her. A flick of her mental hand could bend a current. A quiet intention could draw a fragment closer. It was exhausting but exhilarating. She had never felt so alive even in this strange in-between. "Captain," Mara's voice trembled. "It's amazing. I can feel." The others were together. Nova smiled, though fatigue weighed on her. "That's it, Mara, we stick together. That's how humans survive. That's what makes us strong." As they gathered, Nova noticed something new. The void was full of shapes, floating structures of light and energy that seemed to pulse with intelligence. Some resembled buildings, others like strange plants, and a few even looked like creatures, though she could not be sure. The shapes did not harm them, but they watched, curious and aware. Nova's mind raced. Could this be an intelligence? A consciousness larger than anything humans had ever known? She had read about ancient entities rumored to exist beyond known space, but no one had ever seen one. And yet here it was, some vast presence sensing her thoughts, measuring her intent. "Stay focused," she whispered. She could feel the curiosity of the void brushing against her mind. "We mean no harm. We just want to survive." Her calm, determined thoughts seemed to resonate with the energy around her. Slowly, the shapes began to shift, forming a pattern that mirrored the cluster of her crew. The void was responding. It was learning. It was communicating. Nova realized that she could attempt something incredible. If the void could understand her intentions, she might be able to use it to guide her crew closer to reality, to bring them back from the edge between life and nothingness. But it would take focus, creativity, and courage, qualities uniquely human. "Everyone, hold on," Nova said, though her voice was only for herself. She concentrated, sending a wave of intention through the void. She imagined a bridge, a path of light that connected the scattered echoes to a single point, a safe place where they could gather and regain strength. At first, nothing happened. The currents twisted, the light scattered, and doubt tried to creep into her mind. But Nova's determination did not falter. She remembered the countless times humans had faced impossible odds, fought disasters, and survived. This was no different. They would survive because she believed in them, and because she believed in humanity. Slowly, the bridge began to take shape. Light threads stretched from the farthest fragments toward Nova's center, weaving a shimmering pathway through the void. Each pulse of her crew followed it cautiously, unsure but drawn by her unwavering focus. "Captain, it's working," Mara whispered. "We're moving." Encouraged, Nova pushed harder. She imagined the bridge extending further, stronger, until every fragment could traverse it safely. She felt the void itself guiding them, as if it recognized her intent and offered assistance. But the void was not entirely passive. Shadows of anti-life energy surged along the edges of the bridge, trying to sever the threads. Nova felt their pull, a cold, whispering force that tried to make her doubt herself, to surrender. She gritted her teeth. "No," she said firmly. "Humans don't give up, not now. Not ever." Her words, though spoken aloud, carried through her thoughts, strengthening the bridge. The anti-life currents crashed against it, but the light held. Slowly, one by one, her crew reached the center, their pulses merging into a stable, glowing orb. Nova felt exhaustion in every fiber of her being, but she also felt pride. She had done what no machine or algorithm could do. She had used human intuition, creativity, and courage to survive where technology alone would fail. "Captain, thank you," Kellen said, his voice weak but steady. We never thought we'd see you again." Nova smiled, though tears threatened. "We're not done yet. We have to find a way home. But we're together. That's what matters. That's what makes us human." The void pulsed around them almost approvingly. Nova realized it was learning faster than she imagined. It was not hostile. It reflected the intentions of those who entered it. If they remained focused, if they stayed human in mind and heart, the void would continue to respond, offering possibilities instead of threats. Nova knew that returning home would not be easy. The Aurora was lost, or at least badly damaged. They were far from any human outpost. But she also knew that human beings had survived impossible situations before. They had conquered harsh planets, hostile environments, and deadly cosmic phenomena, and they would do it again. With her crew gathered, Nova began to explore the void more deliberately. She tested her control over the energy currents, mapping paths, identifying safe zones, and learning the rules of this strange dimension. Every small success filled her with hope. Every obstacle reminded her of the value of human perseverance. She discovered that the void allowed her to reach not only her crew, but also fragments of the ship's systems, broken data logs, engine traces, and navigation signals. By reconnecting these, she could create a mental map of where the Aurora had been pulled, and possibly chart a way back to physical space. "This is incredible," Nova whispered to herself. "We are in a place no one has ever reached, and yet we can survive here. We can adapt, we can thrive." As she worked, she realized the full truth of her situation. Humanity's strength did not come from weapons, ships, or technology alone. It came from determination, creativity, empathy, and courage. Here, at the edge between life and nothingness, those traits were their only tools, and they were enough. Nova looked at the glowing orb of her crew, pulsing gently in the void. She felt a sense of pride and responsibility. They had survived the fall. They had not given in to fear, and they were only at the beginning of their journey. The void waited silently, vast and mysterious, but Nova knew that with human ingenuity and spirit, they could face whatever came next. The edge of nothingness was not the end. It was the first challenge in a test of human resilience and imagination. Nova floated in the void, the cluster of her crew glowing faintly around her like tiny stars in the endless darkness. They had survived the first shock of the rift, gathered their scattered consciousnesses, and begun to explore the strange space that existed beyond reality. Yet Nova sensed something new, a presence. It was enormous, ancient and intelligent. It was not hostile, not yet, but it watched, probing the edges of her mind. She had felt powerful entities before in the fleet, massive gravitational anomalies, strange quantum storms, but this presence was different. It seemed to think, to test, and to understand. Its attention pressed on her consciousness, weighing her thoughts, examining her intentions. Nova drew a deep breath. "We are explorers. We mean no harm. We only want to survive and return home," she said aloud. Though the void seemed to hear more than her words, it heard her determination, her courage, her humanity. The present shifted, forming shapes in the darkness. Brilliant towers of light rose and fell, twisting into impossible geometries. Nova could feel illusions crawling into her mind, visions of fear, loss, failure. Her crew appeared injured, lost, or lifeless. The void whispered doubts, each echo designed to shake her resolve. "Nova, we're here." Mara's voice came weakly from the cluster, but Nova could sense her panic. She clenched her fists. "No, we survive. We don't give in." The void pulsed as if pleased with her answer, but the tests did not end. Suddenly, Nova found herself facing visions of herself alone. The Aurora destroyed. Her crew gone. No way home. Every fear she had ever held threatened to swallow her. The darkness was more than space. It was a mirror of her mind. She closed her eyes, summoning the calm that had carried her through so many crises. She thought of her crew, each life tethered to her own by the threads of consciousness she had carefully woven. She thought of humanity, of all the times humans had faced impossible odds and survived through creativity, courage, and unity. "You will not break me," she whispered, a promise more to herself than the void. She focused her energy, sending waves of intention toward the illusions. Slowly, the visions began to crumble. The false images of failure and despair faded, replaced by the familiar cluster of her crew's light pulses. "Captain?" Kellen's voice trembled with uncertainty. "Are we okay?" "Yes," Nova said firmly. "We're stronger than this. We've survived so far, and we'll survive whatever comes next. That is what humans do." The void shifted again. This time, it revealed itself more clearly. A massive, shimmering figure of energy, vast beyond comprehension. It radiated power, and yet there was intelligence behind it. ancient and careful. Nova felt no malice, only curiosity. She realized she was facing a being that had existed long before humans, long before the stars they had mapped, long before their civilizations. What are you? She asked aloud, though she knew it might not answer in words. The void seemed to resonate with her question, forming patterns that shimmered in her mind. Nova felt understanding, not with her ears, but with her consciousness. The entity was a test. It sought to understand whether humanity, in its smallness, could rise above instinct, fear, and selfishness. Could humans act with courage, creativity, and compassion when confronted with the incomprehensible? Nova understood that the void was testing not just her, but the essence of her species. She thought of her crew again, each pulse of consciousness fragile yet resilient. She realized that every human quality she valued, hope, ingenuity, empathy, was a tool. Fear and despair were traps. Courage and thoughtfulness were weapons. The void's challenges became more difficult. It created mazes of energy currents that twisted reality itself, corridors with no end, and storms that seemed to strip memories from her mind. Each trial threatened to scatter her or her crew. She felt exhaustion creeping in, but she refused to surrender. Nova used human ingenuity to adapt. She mapped the currents in her mind, visualizing patterns of safe paths. She guided her crew through illusions, carefully piecing together the fragments into a coherent whole. Each pulse of light became a star in a constellation she drew with her thoughts, a map of life in the chaos of nothingness. At one point, the void presented her with a particularly cruel illusion, the death of her closest friend in the fleet, Commander Varric, who had always been her mentor. She felt the grief as though it were real, a heavy weight pressing on her chest. Yet even then she reached inside herself, finding a calm determination. "False," she whispered. "This is not real. We survive. We live." The illusion shattered like glass, and the void pulsed in acknowledgement. Nova realized that her human mind, capable of hope, creativity, and moral choice, was exactly what the entity valued. Machines could calculate, but only humans could dream, care, and endure in the face of impossibility. Hours, days, perhaps, passed. Nova led her crew through every test the void offered. Each time the challenges grew more intricate, more psychologically demanding. Yet with every trial, she grew more confident in her ability to manipulate the void and guide her team. Finally, the entity appeared in a more serene form, radiating gentle golden light. It no longer pressed illusions upon her. Instead, it seemed to observe her, carefully evaluating. Nova felt a connection, a bridge of understanding forming between them. "You have demonstrated courage, creativity, and care," Nova thought, sending the intention as clearly as if she spoke aloud. The void pulsed, a rhythm of acknowledgement, and the golden light spread over her crew. Each pulse of consciousness glimmered stronger, more solid. "You are human," the entity seemed to convey, not in words but in resonance. "You embody the qualities of life that endure. Fear is temporary. Hope, courage, and choice define existence. You have passed the test." Nova felt a wave of relief, exhaustion washing over her. Yet even in the presence of this ancient intelligence, she remained alert. The void was vast, full of mysteries she had only begun to understand. But she had proven that humans, though small, fragile, and mortal, could navigate the unimaginable and remain true to themselves. "Captain," Mara said softly, her pulse now steady and bright. "Do you think it will help us?" "Yes," Nova replied, a tired but determined smile crossing her face. "It already has. The void has learned that we are not threats, that we are capable of understanding, surviving, and creating. And that is what humans do best." The entity seemed to retreat slightly, not disappearing, but observing from a distance, allowing Nova and her crew freedom. The currents of the void no longer attacked them. Paths through the darkness became stable, The thread she had created to hold her crew together now felt unbreakable. Nova realized that the entity was not an enemy. It was a teacher, a challenge, a mirror. It had tested not just survival instincts, but moral strength, creativity, and perseverance. Humanity had passed, not because of technology, weapons, or raw power, but because of the qualities that machines and alien intelligences could not replicate. She looked at her crew, each pulsing light steady, resilient. They had survived together through nothing but willpower, courage, and thought. Nova felt pride, not just for herself, but for humanity as a whole. The void, ancient and intelligent, would continue to watch. Perhaps it would test them again, perhaps not. But Nova knew one thing. Humans had shown that even at the edge of life and nothingness, they could endure. Nova guided her crew to a safe center in the void, a calm area where energy currents formed gentle waves instead of violent storms. Here she could rest, plan, and prepare for the next stage of their journey, returning to physical reality. But she also knew that the lessons of the void were more than survival. They were proof that humanity's greatest strength was not in machines, not in power, but in the mind, the heart, and the spirit. We've survived the test, Nova said softly. But this is only the beginning. There is more to understand, more to explore, and we will face it. Together. The void pulsed around them, vast and silent, but Nova felt no fear. They had faced the unimaginable and emerged stronger. Humanity's courage, ingenuity, and compassion had carried them through darkness where others might have fallen. And in that moment, Nova knew that no matter what challenges awaited them, they would endure. Because humans, even fragile and small, could rise beyond fear, beyond despair, and beyond the edge between life and nothingness, and Nova was ready to lead them further. Nova floated in the calm center of the void, the faint light pulses of her crew forming a stable cluster around her. They had survived the ancient entity's tests, proving the strength of human courage, creativity, and morality. But survival was only the first step. Nova knew the true challenge awaited, to reclaim life itself and return to the physical universe. "Captain, how do we go back?" Mara asked, her voice soft but full of concern. Nova looked at the cluster, each pulse of her crew glowing steadily. "We can do this," she said firmly. "We've learned how to work with the void. We just need to guide ourselves back, carefully." The void, immense and alive, pulsed as if listening. Nova felt its currents moving around her, gentle but powerful. She realized that they could use these currents not as obstacles but as pathways. Every fragment of her crew, every broken trace of the aurora, could be aligned into a bridge back to reality. Nova focused her mind, imagining the threads of consciousness stretching outward like glowing ropes. She envisioned the aurora, the ship they had lost, and their place in the universe. Slowly, the void responded, bending energy around her thoughts, creating faint shapes resembling the ship and familiar spatial points. "We need to reconnect with the ship's systems first," she said, thinking aloud. "If we can gather the fragments of the engines and navigation controls, we can form a guide to real space." Kellen, the engineer, nodded. "I can feel it. Broken systems. Scattered. But there's a pattern. We can rebuild it." Together they reached toward the fragments. Nova guided her mental focus, and Kellen began assembling pieces of the ship's energy and data. Light threads stretched across the void, connecting broken components, forming circuits and control panels in midair. It was like watching the ship reconstruct itself in another dimension. "This is incredible," Lyra whispered. "It's like we are making the aurora in the void." "Yes," Nova said, smiling faintly. "But it's more than a ship. It's a bridge home, and it will only work if we stay together, calm and focused." The void, sensing their combined intention, began to pulse more rhythmically. It seemed to approve of their efforts, as if granting them the possibility of success. But it also reminded them that it was not entirely passive. Currents of anti-life energy still surged around the edges, threatening to scatter the threads. Nova gritted her teeth. "We will not fail. We have faced worse than this." She focused on each crew member, strengthening their connection to the ship and to each other. The reconstruction of the aurora was slow and painstaking. Each fragment needed attention. Each thread required careful alignment. Mistakes could mean losing a crew member's consciousness. Nova felt fatigue pressing on her mind and body, but she refused to stop. Every human quality she possessed, creativity, determination, hope, became a tool in this impossible task. Hours, perhaps days, passed. The void tested them with sudden distortions, currents that twisted the fragments, pulses that tried to lure the crew away. Nova remained calm, using mental shields and directing her team with clear, precise thoughts. Slowly, the ship's fragments formed a coherent shape. The engines glimmered faintly. The controls began to respond, and the hull's outline shimmered in the void's darkness. "It's working," Mara said, her pulse brightening. We can do it," Nova nodded. "Good. Now we take the next step." She directed her attention to the bridge, imagining the path from the void to reality. Slowly, the currents began to align, forming a corridor of glowing energy. It was narrow, unstable, but it existed. "Hold on to me," Nova called to her crew, though her words were more for mental focus than sound. They linked their consciousnesses, following the thread she had prepared. The void pulsed and shivered as they moved through it, waves of anti-life energy crashing around them. Nova's mind raced. "Steady, focus on the bridge!" Together, each pulse of light held onto hers, forming a chain that could not be broken. The void seemed to test them again, but Nova's human determination was stronger than any illusion or force it could throw. Finally, after what felt like eternity, the corridor narrowed into a pinpoint of bright energy. Nova felt the pull of real space, gravity, and the familiar hum of the universe. She gritted her teeth and pushed her team forward, leading them toward the light. One by one, her crew followed, and the fragments of the Aurora coalesced around them. Engines roared faintly, controls flickered back to life, and the familiar scent of recycled air filled their senses, proof that they were returning to reality. Nova collapsed briefly as they crossed the final threshold, exhaustion overwhelming her. But she opened her eyes to see the cockpit of the Aurora restored, her crew safe and the void fading like a dream behind them. Humanity's ingenuity and courage had turned impossibility into triumph. Mara smiled weakly. "We made it. We're alive." "Yes," Nova said, her voice trembling with relief. "Because we never gave up. That's what humans do." As the Aurora drifted back toward known space, Nova gazed at the stars. The void had tested them, challenged them, and nearly destroyed them. Yet they had survived. Humanity had endured the impossible, and they would continue to do so because of their courage, their creativity, and their unity. Nova and her crew emerged from the void into familiar space. The stars stretched before them, steady and bright, a vast network of possibilities waiting to be explored. Though the Aurora had sustained minor damage, the ship and its crew were intact. They were alive, stronger, and wiser than before. "Captain," Kellen said, his voice soft, "I never imagined anything like that." "How did we survive?" Nova smiled, looking at each of her crew members. "We survived because we are human. Not because of technology, not because of luck, but because we have courage, creativity, and hope. That is what carried us through." The void still lingered behind them in memory, a strange, alive place beyond understanding. But Nova realized that humanity had gained something far greater than survival: insight. They had learned what their species could endure, what their minds and hearts could accomplish even in the face of the unimaginable. She piloted the Aurora toward the nearest human outpost. Reports of the anomaly and their disappearance had already reached Fleet Command. When they arrived, they were greeted not only as survivors, but as pioneers who had ventured where no human or any other being had ever gone. "Nova," the commanding officer said, eyes wide with respect, "you've done more than survive. You've proven what humanity is capable of." Nova nodded. "We did not just survive. We learned the universe is vast, full of dangers, but also full of possibilities. And humanity can meet them all, if we stay true to ourselves." As the crew of the Aurora recovered, Nova reflected on the lessons of the void. Technology alone would not carry humanity forward. Power alone would not guarantee survival. What made humans extraordinary was their spirit, their courage to face the unknown, their creativity to solve impossible problems, and their ability to care for one another even in despair. The journey ahead would be difficult. Other anomalies, other threats, and other discoveries awaited, but Nova knew that humanity had proven itself capable of enduring the unimaginable. They would explore, they would adapt, and they would thrive. Nova gazed out at the stars, feeling a mix of awe and determination. Humanity had reached the edge between life and nothingness and emerged stronger. And this was only the beginning. She thought of the void, of the ancient intelligence, of the currents of anti-life energy they had survived. Humanity had faced challenges that no other species might endure. Yet they had not only survived, they had learned, adapted, and grown. "This is just the beginning," Nova said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "The universe is vast, but we are human, and we will rise to every challenge it gives us." Her crew smiled, understanding her meaning. Together they were explorers, survivors, and pioneers of humanity's destiny, and Nova knew that as long as they held on to courage, creativity, and hope, there was no edge they could not cross, no darkness they could not illuminate, and no challenge they could not overcome. The stars stretched on, endless and shining. Humanity would follow them, and Nova, captain and guide, would lead the way. The void had tested them. Humanity had answered, and the universe would never forget the light they carried beyond the edge of nothingness.